Okay, we're rolling again, and you want to start?
Thank you.
Beth?
Talk to me a little bit about what role you see that ASM played in the creation of cultural resource management as an industry.
Well, both Emil and I took the position that the museum has certain responsibilities to the archaeological resources of the state. Mm-hmm. That would be true if there were no legislation, but that the legislation also, unfortunately, Cummings looked upon it as controlling the archaeological resources of the state, mm-hmm. rather than preserving them for the benefit of it. There's a difference here, I think, that in fact, some of Cummings' battles with the Odd Halset, for example, in Phoenix, two men who loved battles, that was a mistake. But both of them wanted to control the archaeology. That was and they used that language, you see. Whereas both Emil and I took the position that we have a responsibility, historical as well as legal, to preserve these resources, make them available to the people of the state, to qualified researchers, blah, blah, blah. And so over the years, whenever an opportunity would turn up to do something appropriate, the museum would. You know, early on, Emil would suddenly, he would gather up 3 or 4 students and they would go out some Saturday and rescue something. Because that was a responsibility and it was mm-hmm. going to go down the drain if they didn't rescue mm-hmm. it. Mm-hmm. And gradually this was furthered by the situation that the National Park Service, which had this responsibility for the whole nation, with very little money to spend, would every so often come along and say, hey, X is going to happen here in Arizona, and we don't like what's going to happen as a result of it, and we can't do much about it, but we've got $6,000. If we give it to you, will you take care of it? Well, often $6,000 was not enough by any stretch of the word. But the museum would say, okay, we'll, both under Emil and under me, yeah, we'll take the $6,000 and we'll stretch it to the extent we can, mm-hmm. and we'll solve the problem. So that there began to be a partnership between the federal government and the museum to play that role in Arizona. Obviously, this is a role that we were ill prepared to fulfill. We didn't have the resources, the money, mm-hmm. and so forth to do it, but we stood up to the challenge whenever the opportunity presented itself. And then gradually, both here in Arizona and in other states, it became clear that there were a small number of institutions like ASM scattered around the country who were Horatio at the bridge in this field. And as the cultural resource management business began to move along and money became available through the work of McGimsey and others, the museum was doing a fair amount of this work. And not always eager to do it, but we were doing it because somebody needed to do it. It was a false problem, though, because pretty soon the Arizona State Museum found itself doing all the archaeology in the state because there was money for it. And the museum wasn't doing anything else. Mm. Now, it's true that a certain amount of income came to us in the kickback from the 15% that the university took. Mm-hmm. And that would help pay for things. Mm-hmm. For example, mm-hmm. it helped keep Kiva alive because we could pay for publishing the results of the archaeology in the Kiva mm-hmm. using that kind of money. but we were not an organization that was set up to run a personnel system, a fleet of trucks. We didn't have the accounting system to handle it. The university did not provide us with that. In fact, threw up all kinds of roadblocks for us to do it in the first place. And it seemed, if you looked at the big picture, we were getting to the point where we were beginning to get well beyond our capabilities in coming up to the challenge of doing this. And we were doing all kinds of crazy things. We were, the state law says that only qualified institutions can get a permit. So we were giving permits through the Archaeological Society in Phoenix, through Arc and HIS here. We were not giving permits, but we were forging partnerships with other archaeological organizations so that they were working under our permit. And these were really stopgap things. This is the duct tape approach to the problem. And at this very same period of time, the federal government was also beginning to have problems. I was by this time the chairman of the Committee for the Recovery of Archaeological Remains. And Rex Wilson was the manager of that program. He had been here in Arizona. He started out in Globe with the Archaeological Center and moved to Tucson. He and I had a pretty good working relationship. I helped to get his picture book on bottles from archaeological sites published, and he did a number of, we had a good working relationship.
Standard reference still, yes, yes.
At the last meeting of the CRAR, I probably screwed it up myself, but Rex came in and began to attack all of us because we were hogging all of the federal money for archaeology. And being someone who had been involved in these earlier projects where they were giving us $6,000 and we were bootlegging $12,000 out of our own money to do a job, I didn't like that.
Right, right.
Whatever
it looked like to outsiders, you knew inside it was a different story.
That was not true.
Yes.
And I did not like the idea of building something by tearing something else down. And I objected very seriously to that. That really pissed Rex off. We never had another meeting of the CRAR. And they came up with there's a law which says that you can't have advisory committees that aren't created by the organization itself. And we were an independent group, and that was the end of the CRAR. It was probably a good thing. Fred Johnson had wanted it to die once the river basin system was established. He was very pragmatic. We set out to do a job, we did it, and then we should call it quits. Other people said, well, there are still problems in the federal government, we need to continue prodding.
CRAR could have been a way to deal with that.
And so it did. But clearly, I'm just telling you this little anecdote to show you that there was a growing crisis in American archaeology because of this concept that only favored academics should do archaeology. Only people in museums and universities should do archaeology. Well, originally that was a way of keeping looters out. Okay. Now, however, we have a considerable number of people. We trained them ourselves. We taught them how to do this, who are out there doing very good archaeology, and yet we're telling them that we can't do it. And we're telling them that they can't do it in an environment where the need is growing daily, and we need people to do it. And we know, or at least I knew in terms of the Arizona State Museum, that it's going to kill the museum if we continue to be just a big CRM operation, digging up sites all over Arizona. We have other responsibilities, educational, service, research. We can't afford to just have the museum be a front person for a big quasi-archaeology business. And so we saw to it that when the new Antiquities Act came out, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, it gave permission to this Department of the Interior to give permits to qualified research organizations and businesses.
Not just academic institutions.
Not just academics. That then meant that there was a precedent for us to do it here in Arizona. So Keith Kintig was our assistant archaeologist at the time, and my policy has always been to hire good people and put them to work doing it. We came up with some very simple wording of the Antiquities Act. I think it's nothing more than adding qualified institutions and business organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I think just those words were put in the Antiquities Act. Keith had come to know Greg Lunn, who was a senator from Tucson in the Arizona legislature. He was a Republican. And I wanted to use a Republican to change the law in Arizona.
Because you knew it would be easier to get more support for it,
well,
I suspect. Yes.
Also, we could make the case, which we did to Greg, but when we went to the committee in Phoenix to talk about it, we didn't emphasize this. We made the case to Greg that this is good for business. We are now supporting this emerging large business community in Arizona called cultural resource management. It doesn't say that in the law, but that's what's being supported.
But that, yes, certainly was true.
And I did not feel, I mean, we didn't have much support on all of this from people like people at ASU, because they now had their own CRM program, and they wanted to get all the contracts for themselves. See, well, I thought, not my business what they want to do, but I thought that would be a mistake anyway, that no one institution should dominate this. If we're going to play a role, our role should be to facilitate this. And we did facilitate it at the beginning, taking these small contracts with the Park Service, then picking up the larger contract when nobody else was able to do it, but there are other people out there now able to do it. We should enlist their help in doing it. In fact, when I went to the committee, I took Dave Phillips with me, starving private sector archaeologists, to show them that we had qualified people who should be given that opportunity.
He could lend his personal testimony to the plan.
Yeah, and it worked out fine. It meant that we could wind down our program so that we no longer had to put 98% of our efforts into salvage archaeology and could do other things that we were supposed to do in the museum.
So you didn't really see that as any kind of a, you didn't see CRM at ASM as any kind of a
It was not
really
a threat
viable
to ASM.
business model.
It was a way, by supporting it, was a way for ASM to continue its responsibility to further things that will be valuable within the state of Arizona. And as it turned out, we have one of the largest concentrations of CRM firms in the nation, not only mom and pop ones, but also big organizations with millions of dollars of capitalization, like Bill Doyley's outfit,
yes,
Statistical Research,
Desert Archaeology.
Yeah, these are outfits that are
SWCA.
doing. They're not only doing a wonderful job, but they're doing something that we couldn't do. They are hiring our students not only to do their work, but they're supporting their students to get their dissertations done and to help them publish the dissertation.
Yes.
Which we didn't have the resources to do.
Yeah.
You know. So if you look at the big picture of all of this, the big picture is how can the Arizona State Museum dominate everything? The big picture is how can the Arizona State Museum facilitate the growth of archaeology, preservation, tourism, you name it, in Arizona. Well, and that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Right, and the consequences of that are that it seems to me that ultimately the Department of Anthropology has added a new program in cultural resource management too, a new master's program, because it has become such a good industry in Arizona and elsewhere that they can support more students in it.
Well,
and students are eager to get that kind of training.
Exactly, and it's gotten to the point that Tucson, Arizona must have more archaeologists per square meter than any place in the country. I mean, seriously.
Everybody agrees with that, yes. Actually, I think Barbara Mills has proven that to be true in a
Is
recent
that true?
study, yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't be a bit surprised.
She got some Bureau of Labor Statistics data or something and showed that that was in fact the case. So.
Well, this is a good example, it seems to me, of the fact that at different periods of time, we want the Arizona State Museum to be a leader in the promotion of anthropology, archaeology, preservation of sites, the development of tourism, all of the kinds of things that are generated by archaeological work. But we do that in different ways at different periods of time. We do that pragmatically today one way and pragmatically tomorrow another way. We don't do it by just accumulating power to ourselves.
I'd like to switch topics a little bit, although the theme of pragmatism may continue to underlie it, but you'll let me know. For many years, Cummings set the pattern, and you and Dr. Howery followed it, of managing both a museum and an academic department. Started out as archaeology and then became anthropology under Dr. Howery. And I believe that up until about 1980, you continued that pattern and were the head of anthropology and the director of the museum. And talk to me a little bit about how that split came about and what led up to that and what do you think the consequences have been?
Well, to begin with, I think we all have to admit that there are enormous advantages to having the same person run both organizations. Just think of simple things. As department head, you report to the dean of the college. As director, you report to the president of the university. In those days, now to the
senior vice president.
That means that the department benefit from information that comes through the museum days before any other department head knows about it. I mean, you just think about that.
Yes.
Okay, so that something is coming up, and the Department of Anthropology already has a proposal to take advantage of it, and the other department heads are just finding out that it's going to happen. That alone is a very valuable advantage. The other part of it is that the department can do things the museum can't do, and the museum can do things the department can't do. For example, when I came in, we were having a very difficult time getting enough graduate assistantships in the department. Well, President Harville told me that he was stuck, that the legislature and the Board of Regents were not going to go for more graduate assistants in the departments, but he could put them in the museum.
Oh, that's interesting. That's terrific.
Okay, so up until the time the budget crisis came and we had to give them all up, we had almost as many assistantships in the museum to support students in the Department of Anthropology as we did in the department. I mean, these are just simple little examples, but you add them all up together and the advantages are enormous. So you come to the point, as Emil said, when I took over, apparently Dean Reason and the president of the university discussed whether they should split these things. And Dean Reason being a very pragmatic person, they decided not to. So Emil got both jobs. Okay, about halfway through his tenure, things began to pile up on him, and he began to wonder, I better get out from under one of these things. And they had discussions within the university about it, and everybody said, hey, the advantages are too great. We can't afford to do it now.
Interesting.
When Emil stopped and I came in, we had this same discussion. What's the best thing to do? Well, in terms of the individual involved, the workload is incredible. That's not the best thing to do. But in terms of what's best for the institution, we better hang on to them. And that's what we did. Well, by the time 1980 comes along, when I finally stepped down, it was entirely clear that I was able to continue doing it, partly because I wasn't doing some of it well, partly because I was letting some things go.
Right. You have to make those decisions.
Yeah.
Yep.
But partly because I had grown up with it. By this time, I had had 16 years of doing it. So that I wasn't facing each new problem as a new problem. I already learned ways to juggle them and so forth. But a new guy coming in doesn't have that advantage. We're handing somebody a job, you know, running this museum and running the Department of Anthropology, by now one of the major departments in the nation, one of the largest faculties, largest number of graduate students, largest number of PhDs produced, blah, blah, blah. These are full-time jobs for anybody. You know, it is, are we going to be able to recruit a good person to come in and be enough of a masochist to agree to do that?
Right.
You see.
Yeah.
It's a mistake to do that. So, in effect, this is a sort of situation where, again, you start out saying, well, what's best for the institution? And you continue to do things until it becomes clear that it's not good for the institution to have one person handling two jobs and half the time screwing up on one of them. No question, but that has to be the result, because you don't have enough time to do everything. And you say, okay, I'll let that go. And 6 months later, boy, you're sorry you let that go.
But you had to make those decisions all the time.
But you had to make the decision at the time, and it was the wrong decision. So it's bad for the institution to ask one person to do too many things. And you can say, well, you can have that person make all the decisions and just have assistant department heads, associate directors, and so forth doing it. Well, that's what you've got the vice president for research and the deans for. That's not, you don't have, you know. Emil was the first person to suggest that there be a school of anthropology. That was one of his solutions to doing this. You know, a director of the school and director of the museum, but they decided not to do that. In fact, the crisis was in the graduate college, and we, mostly me, convinced the graduate college that since anthropology had archaeology, physical, cultural, linguistics, that we could major only in one of them instead of in all of them. And that reduced the pressure on the department and so forth to handle all these graduate students. And the graduate college agreed to that. Psychology and anthropology were allowed to do that. So that the pressure in anthropology was lowered, and they stopped thinking about the school concept. You know, you use different gimmicks for solving the same problem.
What did you mean by the crisis was in this College of Education?
None of the colleges.
Graduate college, sorry.
Because of the burden of graduate students.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay.
You know, we now had large numbers of graduate students, not enough money to support all of them. We're forcing every of them to go through a cookie-cutter system of education at a time when some archaeologists should get the CRM business, some linguists should get something else. Cultural anthropologists don't all have to be Boasians, and you know, we should begin to specialize these things so that they're getting the education they need.
Right.
And that meant, since we didn't put them through the cookie-cutter business, that we didn't have this huge blockage in the system, so to speak. And that reduced the pressure in various ways, so it was decided, well, we'll continue to stumble along the way we're going. And then the time came for me to take over from Emil, and we decided we will continue to stumble along with the one man making these decisions. And there's no question but what this has had a lot to do with the strength of anthropology in the State Museum today.
Well, and it seems to me that today, the way things are going, as the department itself becomes more global in scope, that the continuation of Arizona and, in fact, southwestern anthropology really resides here.
It resides in the
State
museum. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I saw this happening at the University of New Mexico. See, they decided that they were going to have a specialist in every part of the world. So all of a sudden, New Mexico went from being a key place for southwestern archaeology to an omnibus department of anthropology. It isn't that it wasn't a good thing to do in terms of their global approach to things. Anthropology is a global discipline, blah, 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 but it meant that they were giving up southwestern archaeology. And I didn't think that I wanted that to happen here in Arizona. There would be other ways of doing it, and that's where we began to put greater emphasis in the museum, to make sure that we were hiring people in the museum that could be acceptable to the department to teach Southwestern archaeology,
And that's
that
yes,
sort of thing.
still
To
habit we
projects
follow,
in the
yes.
museum that would provide opportunities for graduate students, and because that, after all, is an important part of our historical reputation. Why throw it away?
Yes, for training,
mean,
student training.
Yeah.
And these days there is increasing emphasis on giving students a real engagement process with the university and not just 4 years of lecture halls.
Right.
And I think the museum has a big role
Had a
to play
big
in
role
that.
to play in all of that.
What about the creation of the homology research program? I believe that began under your directorship.
Well, that's an interesting one. Bruce Babbitt was governor, and he was very supportive of a lot of things. For example, he's the one who created the Arizona Archaeology Commission that exists to this day.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
And
Okay.
the state parks were expanding in various ways. Various crises were beginning to emerge in various state parks that the parks system itself was unable to handle, and homology was one of them. People were pot hunting, it was being exposed to erosion, and we all went to homology and stood on one of those mounds, and Bruce Babbitt made a speech about how they were going to preserve homology and so forth, and basically says, well, we've done our part, what's the university going to do now? And looked right at me. That's how the homology
That was the instant birth of the homology research program?
I mean, obviously a few other things had to be done to get it going, but that's the true origin of it. That was the conception, if not the birth. But that was an interesting experience.
Did the state follow through with funding for that?
Yeah, we got funding for it.
Oh, that's good.
And Chuck got funding, and it became a mosaic, again, of all of the things that can be done, and it worked out very well. And it worked out to the extent that it not only did some things for the preservation of Havoley State Park, provided information for their interpretive program, etc., but because of the needs of the archaeology, to place that in the context of the whole region and the context of the history of the Hopi tribe, it meant that an entire regional program emerged out of this little tiny effort to make Homology State Park work.
Yeah. And continues to
And
this day.
continues to serve in that respect.
Yeah, and it has meant really great things not only for our understanding of that part of the state, but for the development of cordial relations with the Hopi tribe.
That's right.
And Chuck has used it as an opportunity to train lots of students and involve
Very
lots
good
of
ones. Excellent.
interested members of the public.
And nationally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell me why you think Ventana Cave is so important in American archaeology.
Well, for a long time, American archaeology had no chronology. People were guessing, Cummings thought that Cuicuilco was 20,000 years ago. Kidder thought that Basket Maker was all before Christ. The mound builders could have gone back to the lost tribes of Israel as far as anybody knew. I mean, people didn't know what the hell was going on. Then along comes three-ring dating. And a place called the Southwest gets control of its chronology. And that chronology was working very well. And it made the Southwest basically the focus of almost anything you wanted to do in Southwestern archaeology. Because no matter what your theoretical or ideological orientation is, without a chronology you cannot make cultural interpretations. The difference between how you look at Basket Maker Pueblo, if you take the view pre-Pecos Conference and pre-Tree Rings, where you've got 2.5 millennia before Chaco Canyon, that's a different kind of cultural development than if you've only got 800 years. Very, very different. So the Southwest became terribly important to everything in American archaeology and gave opportunities here for us to do things that no one else could do. And so I think...
And so Van Canna helped with that stratigraphy,
I think
developing that.
What you see here is that with tree ring dating and cross dating, we began to piece together for the entire Southwest regional chronologies like Anasazi, Mogollon, Prescott area, Casas Grandes, Holcomb, all pieced together from a little stratigraphy here, a little tree rings there, a little ceramic analysis here.
Patchwork quilt.
Patchwork quilt.
Date systems.
So that it's not only regional, but making the whole thing work together is an even larger patchwork quilt. What made Emil's contribution at Snaketown so important was he took all of these elements and produced the Snaketown chronology. And while the early end of it was a little early, to be correct, the rest of the chronology is held up extremely well.
Right, it still works. Yeah.
Well, then he goes to Ventana Cave. And for the first time in the history of American archaeology, anywhere, in one place, we find the entire chronology from the age of Ice Age mammals to tourists visiting the Papago Reservation. And that made Ventana Cave an iconic place in American archaeology. Sure, you've got various caves in Utah and in the state of Washington that give pieces of this, but it's the only place in the country to this date where you've got the entire cultural sequence in one place. And it happened in the place where we already had those wonderful chronological controls. So that instead of just standing in isolation, hey, here's this great cave, it's a cave in this place where we already know a lot about it, all of it. And I'm sure that's why he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Right after he published that volume, he was in the National Academy. But I think that, this is my argument for you, but I think I'm correct that that's why it happened, why it's so important, even to this day.
Yes, still, right. As well as an interesting place to visit. Talk a little bit more about the difference between running a department and a museum, and what challenges you found from going from one to the other, just in terms of management styles and problems that you dealt with.
Well, I wrote a paper on that called, I don't know what it's called now, Principles of Academic Administration or something like
that, yes.
Gil Kushner had a program about academic administration, and I think it was at a meeting in Las Vegas, and asked me to give a paper, which I did, and it got published in Practicing Anthropology. And the way I answered your question in that paper was to say that I became, at the age 40, I became the top dog in two entirely different kinds of organizations. In the department, I was dealing with something like a band of tundra hunters. Where my position depended on keeping all of those people happy, making sure that we always had reindeer to kill.
And tundra hunters carry large spears.
Large spears, yeah. And they can be a fractious group. And tundra hunters often break off into different groups, splinter groups. And so this was a very interesting kind of organization. I had to keep them happy. I had to make them think that I was doing a good job. I had to get them in an attitude which would enable them to vote in faculty immunities from the things I wanted to do. And that meant that I had to have a personal relationship with every one of those people. I had to be willing to sit in my office and have them come in and complain to me that they weren't getting enough research help, and sympathize with them and tell them I'm sorry we can't do anything about it, and they would go away happy. I had to stroke them to make them feel that while things weren't going too well for them, that they were doing a wonderful job. All of these kinds of things that you do in an organization where the relationship is one that's based upon constantly shifting relationships and constantly shifting problems. On the other hand, in the museum, I found myself in charge of a small empire, which had a totally authoritarian system where the director made all of the decisions and ran everything. But that, in order for the director to do that, it was also important for him to have a personal relationship with every one of those people who were being mandated to do things. True, they were being told to do it rather than being cajoled into doing it. But the fact that they were being controlled to do it could mean that they were not going to do it, by God, if they could help it. So they had to be in a position to want to do it. And they had to be in that position only if I went and visited their departments, found out what their problems were, made an effort to solve their problems, made them feel that I felt that they were doing a good job. It only worked if I hired people and turned them loose to do a good job, rather than micromanaging their departments at all times. I mean, I constantly got criticism that I was letting somebody do something, or that I wasn't making them do it a different way.
I get the same criticisms.
Yeah, I felt that, letting Bunny Fontana go off and do some kinds of crazy Johnny Ward Ranch was not exactly what we hired him to do as ethnologist at the Arizona State Museum. Well, it was a damn good thing to do, and it was worth letting him do it. That sort of thing was an important part of it. So in some respects, I'm giving you an artificial description of the two organizations, in the sense that if my job was to do the same thing in both of them, I was just doing it in a different administrative framework.
Okay. That's interesting. You said in your 2005 history of anthropology at the University of Arizona, no sins coming back here. You referred to, quote, the more disruptive intradisciplinary conflicts that characterized some university anthropology departments that you were bent on avoiding at the U of A. Would you care to elaborate on some of those for the camera?
Well, I think there are two things that cause all of that. One of them was the increasing specialization in anthropology, which meant that in a department, I mean, let's not forget that most of those departments were pretty small. My graduate college had 5 professors. Boaz had 4 or 5 colleagues. Kroger had 5-person faculty. Cummings had a 5-person faculty. We're not talking about large numbers of people, but the field begins to expand. And you get this kind of anthropologist, that kind of anthropologist. And as soon as you do that, you get conflicting goals. And that makes problems with any organization. The other side of the coin is that this was a period of time when the major departments in this country were beginning to lose the founding fathers. Boaz dies, Kroger dies, Lowy dies, Redfield dies. Most of these places had made absolutely no preparation for that. So here we are. Here are these powerful people who kept these places together, made them work, made them what they were, and all of a sudden they're gone. And they're replaced by 25 people, each one of which thinks he's got a better idea as to how that place should operate. Seriously. Even this, and even beyond that, this is compounded in a place like Columbia, where you had the old line Boasians and the new line anti-Boasians like this. Natalie Woodbury was a wonderful informant on that. She was right in the middle of that. She had grown up with the Boasians, but she had a lot of new ideas. She, as a graduate student, she became a personal broker who moved back and forth between these groups and talked them out of doing things and into doing things, because they were incapable of talking to each other and reaching decisions. Can you imagine that? I mean, and these are intelligent people who are supposed to be talking about human organization. Berkeley is another case. Berkeley almost became a series of mini departments, sharing the same building but never talking to one another. I was terrified when I saw that this was going on. What are we going to do about this? Can we afford to grow? Well, we had to grow. And all of a sudden, instead of having 500 people in introductory anthropology, we had 3,000. We got to have more faculty members.
Right.
You introduce more faculty members, and you got all these different goals to deal with. And at the same time, the Clara Lee Tanners, the Emil Howries, the Harry Gettys, the Edward Spicers, they're disappearing. What are we going to do about it? Well, I don't know. The one thing that I did that I think helped a great deal, I convinced the dean, using the same arguments I've talked to you about, that we can't afford to have the founding fathers go away someday and expect to maintain our status in the world. You've got to give me positions so that I can hire the replacement for Spicer, for Howry, for Hulse, and so forth, 4 or 5 years before they retire.
Yes.
So that those individuals will become socialized in this department and committed to its goals and the goals of its founding fathers.
Otherwise, it's very disruptive.
Otherwise, it's very disruptive.
One leaves and a new one comes in at the same time. There's no continuity.
There's no continuity. And they allowed me to do that. Do you know that in the recent budget cuts, they went all the way back to that period? And they didn't make me mortgage the positions. I could hire the replacement before the person retired. They went back and remortgaged those positions and forced anthropology to count those as extra positions in their budget.
Yeah, I know. It's been incredibly difficult. Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
Yeah.
But it worked for us. The other thing I tried to do, and I guess this is where the moderation comes back into play, as we hired new faculty members, I set down a number of conditions. We want to be able to give our students new ideas, new faculty members, new theoretical positions. We don't want to become fossilized. We want all of these things. But when we hire somebody who is able to tell our students about this new point of view, that person has got to be personally compatible with the faculty we already have got here. We're not going to hire some asshole egoist who's going to come in and tear up the department by insisting that everything has to be done his way. I got a lot of flack for that because I insisted upon having a kind of almost iron hand on every recruiting committee. I did not turn the recruiting committee loose, and the recruiting committee only made recommendations to me. I made the final decision. Now, I'm not sure you could do that today, but I got away with it then.
No, I think it can still be a director's prerogative. I don't know about in an academic department. Certainly in the museum, it can still be the director's prerogative.
It might be difficult in an academic department.
It might be. It might be.
But those were my conditions, so that sometimes And we ran, God, we spent thousands of dollars ferrying people in here and interviewing them and so forth, so that everybody got to know all of these people. And I could give them the reasons why I did not want to hire this guy, who was wonderful, who had wonderful ideas, but grew up in a world where there were no people, so he never learned to relate to other people. Yeah, I mean, there are people like that.
Yeah.
We can't afford to hire that guy.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to hire this guy whose luster may be a little bit less, but who related to all of our graduate students and they loved them, and already is talking about a joint research project with a junior faculty. I mean, those are the guys we want to hire. Yeah. So that's the way we did it. So
it has to be a cooperative enterprise.
Those were the two approaches that I used to avoid collapsing when the founding fathers go, and to avoid breaking apart when the new people came in.
Yeah. So you've been observing American archaeology and anthropology for, my math isn't that good, at least 60 years, 65 years.
That many?
Something like that.
Yeah.
What do you see today that particularly appeals to you, that if you could think back to when you first came out to Point of Pines in 1947, what kind of challenge would you see today that might interest you?
Boy, that's a tough one. I don't think I'm very creative there. I think that I would probably have to say something rather mundane, in that there are lots of very interesting... See, when I was in graduate school, you could interpret the archaeological evidence in some kind of global way, or you could get ethnographic information from the region in which the archaeological evidence came, or historic as in the Near East, and interpret it. Now I think we have a lot of very creative things happening, whereby we can use information from sociology, psychology, history, and actually use those potsherds to come up with behavioral things that were simply unimaginable when I was in graduate school. I think that's the big success. Some of the things that Barbara's been doing, for example, using pottery. And that appeals to me because pottery was the thing I was most interested in. I think those are fascinating. And they're obviously giving us entirely new insights into the nature of those prehistoric communities. We wouldn't have had it if it were not for that. I think those are the things that appeal to me the most.
There's still a lot of big unanswered questions out there.
Yeah. And we now are beginning to get ways of answering them.
The archaeology of the Southwest is not the, I don't remember who said it, the sucked orange. With nothing left to find.
Fuchs, I think.
Was that Fuchs?
Of course, he was only 80 when he said that, and believed that he was right on everything. That's what he told Kidder.
Well,
forget about Southwestern archaeology.
Yeah,
I've already done it. It's a sucked orange.
It's been done. It's been done. Nothing left there. Anything you'd like to say to Alex's camera? You haven't been asked about already?
Well, not that I can think of. I think that, you know, if this is anything that I think is the overriding concept that you always have to keep in mind if you accept an administrative position, that is a position with power to make things happen. You have to put yourself somewhat in the background and always ask, when you use that power, is this the best thing for this institution, which I've accepted a responsibility for? What's best for the place? For the institution. Not what's best for me. If I do X, will it increase my salary? That's not the way we look at doing it. If I do X, it will channel much of the museum's money into my research project instead of somebody else's. The thing that makes the difference ultimately is what is the best thing for this place.
For the institution.
That's what responsibility is all about.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you.
Great. I do have one more question for you.
Yeah.
You brought this up. Did you ever meet the man?
I did meet him just before he died, but I never got to know him. I met him over in the main hall of the other building in 1954, I think it was, just enough to shake hands and to say hello to him and so forth. But I never got to know him, which is unfortunate, because you know, how do you judge the way he has been evaluated by other people if you don't know him enough to be able to balance these things out?
Well, I'm glad Alex remembered that question. I had asked it myself yesterday and then forgot it. But yet he had a long and complex career.
Oh, yeah.
And seems, from what I learned in the paper record, to have been a rather strong personality.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, think of it. That man spent 22 years at the University of Utah, resigned over a case of academic freedom, and came down here at age 55 to start all over
Create
again
a whole new
at a
program.
place which had only 70 faculty members and 453 students. Can you imagine that?
No, I can't. I can't. No.
I mean, he was a man who had lots of
Energy.
Yeah. And we got to give him credit. When we look, I'm going to say some of this on the 11th. We look back at Cummings. Some people are very critical of what he did or did not do. Those are unfair criticisms. You know, he came here at the age 55 on a part-time job to both run the department and the museum, starting over again on all of them, and with no help.
Yes, that's absolutely
With no
true.
help,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And to think of what he did accomplish, it's remarkable. And he trained a whole generation of archaeologists who not only served in the Southwest, but in federal agencies. Many states in the eastern United States got people trained in Arizona archaeology. Man, the man accomplished a great deal, and we got to give him credit for it.
Yeah, he did. He did.
And
he saw the department and the museum through the worst depression
the worst
in history.
period of time. Yeah.
Having just dealt with the second worst one in American history, I have a great deal of respect for what he accomplished.
Yeah. He didn't react well, however, to being removed from the museum. He wanted Emil to be department head. Went up to Globe and asked him if he would. But he expected to continue to be museum director. The university, on the other hand, had about 7 or 8 people like him in their 70s.
Yes.
Drawing down the highest salaries in
Right.
the institution.
Yep.
And basically not doing much of anything. And they all had to go. He among them. Well, he agreed he would give up the department headship, but he didn't really tell them, I'm not going to give up the museum. So when they made Emil museum director, he hit the ceiling. And one part of he's always been presented as a very noble individual and gracious, and he was genuine. But also, if you did something that he didn't think was right, boy, he reacted and really came in with all guns blazing. And he gave them a very hard time.
And it would have been, he probably would have appreciated some more recognition from the university for having seen it through a tough phase when he took over the presidency for 2 years.
They didn't understand that.
And then they still turned around and tried to get rid of him.
Look at it from Emil's point of view.
Sure.
The decision was that they would make him director emeritus, so he could have the title. But he would go out and write up his reports, and Emil would run the museum. Well, he wasn't writing up the reports, and he wasn't going to run it, so he didn't like that. They would pay him half his salary for the rest of his life. That is the museum life.
Right, and
So
that was part of because there was not
They
part
had
of
no
it was
retirement,
because
they
there
had
was no
nothing.
retirement system.
They had nothing.
Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, he came out of it pretty well when you think about it. But then think of it from Emil's point of view. He takes over a budget which was nothing anyway, and over a third of it was paying Cummings, and the man lived forever.
Nice job.
It was not a happy situation. And poor Emil also had the problem that he had nothing to say. He had nothing to say about how they were going to treat Cummings. Now, he may have had something to say about his recruitment, because the dean was his brother-in-law, and they had a very close relationship. There was a lot of that involved. So he may well have been involved in the recruitment, and he may have been working toward it for several years with all these family connections. But he had nothing to do with what happened to Cummings or how they did it. But Cummings and all his supporters blamed him for it.
Ooh.
For the rest of his life.
Really?
Clara Lee Tanner, she fought him tooth and nail on that for the rest of his life. And that he kicked the dean out into the cold. He didn't, and he didn't go out into the cold either. He went out with what by Depression standards was a pretty good salary, a pretty good retirement.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, he told Molly when you told him this was awful, he said, "Well, my shoulders are broad," because he did not join the critics of the dean. He had to join them in his head, because he had to criticize the dean enough to identify what we could no longer do, and now we had to do it different to move forward. But he did not do it publicly. He never went out and condemned the dean on any score whatsoever. That was all done by people on the outside talking about it.
There's nothing to be gained by criticizing your predecessors.
None whatsoever.
Whatever you may view the truth as.
Yeah. You may be in for a little, but we'll try to do it in a muted fashion.
On that note.
I have broad shoulders.
Yeah, that's the way to look at it.
Well,
Won't bother me.
Thank you both very much. I hope this comes out.
Well,
Thank you, Alex.
I don't know how much of that is fiction or non-fiction.
You want to add a footnote to the whole thing?
It's on tape now, so I guess
Thank you for remembering. I even put down my question about the dean, and then I got past it and forgot about it.
Yeah.
So it was great. Thank you.
Well, there's no question of why. He was he was an enormously important individual for this institution.
Mm-hmm.
He took over as president from one of the most divisive presidents the institution ever
Yes.
had.
And held the
the
university
place together
for a couple of years. Yeah. I had to when I wrote a letter of thanks and goodbye to Robert Shelton a couple of years ago. I actually quoted something I had read that had been said about Cummings as president, about his ability to bear up under the burden and handle it all gracefully.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I quoted that to Robert Shelton.
And that's Phyllis Ball's comment.
Yes, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was both wanting to thank Robert Shelton because I felt he'd been supportive of the museum, and also make sure I educated him on the role that museum people had played in the institutional history of the university. So
I think Cummings' biggest problem was his belief that he was right. When he believed he was right, boy, there was no holding him back. And that leads you to do things that you shouldn't do. When you have this sense of righteousness. But he was a very serious Presbyterian.
yeah, sometimes it must be fun to act on, though. When he was told that the Attorney General had ruled his Antiquities Act unconstitutional, he said, "Well, that's just the statement of one person," and he continued to hammer away at everything that he was doing. It occurs to me that 1920, what was it, 6 or 7 Antiquities Act was perhaps one of the earliest, if not the first instance of the state of Arizona trying to arrogate responsibilities from the federal government.
A very good one.
But at least we didn't end up in the Supreme Court over it.
No,
So
no.
it was taken care of in a civilized
Yeah.
way. So poor Alex has a ton of equipment to
Yeah.
shut down here.
What can we do to help you, Al?